What if I told you that some of the most important medical discoveries in American history were not built in clean, white laboratories, guided by truth and compassion, but were instead built on silence, lies, and cruelty? What if I told you that for centuries, entire groups of people, African Americans, Native Americans, the poor, immigrants, prisoners, even soldiers sworn to serve their country, were used as test subjects without their knowledge? What if I told you that their suffering became the foundation for medical progress that others benefited from, while they were left behind, in pain, broken, or even dead? We like to imagine that medicine is a story of hope and healing, of brilliant minds defeating disease and saving lives. But in America, that story is complicated by another truth, a darker truth where medicine was also a weapon, where science advanced not with consent, but with coercion. Tonight, we are uncovering one of the most disturbing legacies in American history, the long and hidden story of medical experiments on marginalized people. Most people know the name Tuskegee. They know it as a symbol of betrayal, a case where the government lied to hundreds of African American men for decades. But Tuskegee was not the beginning. It was not even unique. It was part of a much older tradition. Tonight, we will trace that tradition back through the centuries. We will follow it from the plantations of the South to the tenements of the cities, from the reservations to the prisons, from the battlefields to the laboratories. And along the way, we will ask one simple but haunting question. If medicine is supposed to heal, why has it so often been used to harm? The Tuskegee Syphilis Study began in 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression. In Macon County, Alabama, one of the poorest corners of the nation, 600 African American men were recruited with the promise of free medical care. 200 of them were healthy, and 400 carried syphilis. But none of them knew the truth. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a phrase that was vague enough to sound convincing. They were given physical exams, spinal taps, and painful tests. They were offered hot meals and burial insurance, things that mattered deeply in a community where poverty was a daily struggle. They trusted the doctors, because why wouldn't they? These were men in white coats, backed by the U.S. Public Health Service. The men believed they were being healed, but they weren't. They were being observed. The goal of the study was not to cure syphilis, but to watch what happened when syphilis went untreated. Doctors wanted to document the disease from beginning to end, in the flesh of living men. When penicillin was discovered in the 1940s as a safe and effective cure for syphilis, the Tuskegee doctors withheld it. Imagine that. A medicine existed that could have saved lives, but the men were denied it because the experiment mattered more. Over the decades, men went blind. Men lost their minds to dementia. Men suffered heart disease, strokes, and death. Wives were infected. Children were born with congenital syphilis, carrying the disease into a second generation. All the while, the Public Health Service published reports in medical journals presenting the study as if it were legitimate science. For 40 years, the deception continued, until 1972, when a whistleblower leaked the story to the press. By then, more than 100 men had died directly from syphilis, dozens of wives had been infected, and children carried the scars of a disease that could have been cured with a simple injection. Tuskegee shocked the nation. But here is the unsettling truth. Tuskegee was not a freak accident. It was not a one-time betrayal. It was the continuation of a much older pattern, a tradition of experimentation on the powerless that stretched back centuries. To understand Tuskegee, we must return to the 19th century, to a time when American medicine was still finding its footing, and when human rights were reserved for some, but not for others. Enslaved Africans were among the first to be systematically used as test subjects. They were forced to endure procedures, operations, and trials with no say in what was done to them. Their owners signed off on experiments as if they were lending out a piece of equipment, because to them, the enslaved were property, not people. J. Marion Sims, celebrated in medical textbooks as the father of modern gynecology, is perhaps the most infamous figure in this story. Sims built his reputation by developing surgical techniques to repair vesicovaginal fistulas, a condition that left women incontinent after childbirth. His discoveries saved lives and improved women's health. But how did he develop them? By operating repeatedly on enslaved women, Anaka, Lucy, and Betsy, without anesthesia. Sims believed that black women did not feel pain the same way white women did, a cruel myth that justified his experiments. These women endured dozens of operations. They screamed, they suffered, but they had no choice. Their pain became the foundation of women's health care, but their names were nearly erased from history. Sims was not alone. Across the South, enslaved men and women were subjected to medical trials. Doctors tested vaccines on enslaved children before giving them to white patients. Surgeons practiced amputations and procedures on enslaved bodies. Diseases were studied not in labs, but in the flesh of people who could not say no. For the enslaved, the medical world was not a source of healing. It was another site of domination and exploitation. Their bodies were used to build knowledge, but their humanity was denied. This is the soil in which American medicine took root, and Tuskegee would later grow from the same ground. After the Civil War, slavery ended, but exploitation did not. In the booming cities of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the poor and immigrants became the new subjects for experimentation. Charity hospitals offered free care to those who could not afford it, but free care often meant that patients were treated as test subjects. Immigrants arriving from Ireland, Italy, Eastern Europe, and Asia filled the crowded tenements of cities like New York and Boston. They brought their labor, their cultures, and their hopes. But in the eyes of the medical establishment, they also brought opportunity, bodies that could be studied, experimented upon, and often discarded. On Ellis Island, immigrants underwent invasive and humiliating medical inspections. Doctors pulled eyelids, examined skulls, and tested for diseases. Those deemed unfit were deported, while others were funneled into hospitals where they had little power to refuse treatment. In orphanages, children were given experimental vaccines. In poorhouses, patients were subjected to surgical trials. Some experiments were framed as charity, as doctors offering care to the poor, but in reality, the poor were being used as guinea pigs for procedures and drugs that would later be refined and sold to the wealthy. Children were especially vulnerable. In institutions and schools, they were tested without consent. Their small bodies used to advance knowledge that would never be credited to them. The poor, the immigrant, the orphan, they were seen as expendable. And just like the enslaved before them, their suffering was erased from the official story of medical progress. By the mid-20th century, America had become a global power. Its medicine was admired around the world. But beneath that image, the same practices continued. Native Americans faced medical control in the most intimate of ways. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Indian Health Service carried out sterilization programs on Native women. Some were pressured into signing consent forms they did not understand. Others were told the procedure was reversible. Some were not told anything at all. Thousands of Native women were sterilized, stripping communities of future generations. It was not an experiment in the laboratory sense, but it was an experiment in social engineering, using medicine to reduce populations that authorities considered burdensome. At the same time, prisons became hidden laboratories. At Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania, dermatologists ran experiments on inmates from the 1950s to the 1970s. They tested creams, pharmaceuticals, radioactive materials, and toxic chemicals. Inmates were told they could make a little money, but the risks were downplayed. Many were left with burns, scars, cancers, and lifelong health problems. Consent was technically given, but when you are behind bars, how free is that choice? Even soldiers, men in uniform who believed they were serving their country, were not spared. During World War II, U.S. troops were exposed to mustard gas to test protective equipment. In the Cold War, soldiers were placed near nuclear test blasts, told they were witnessing history while their bodies absorbed radiation. Others were given LSD and hallucinogens as part of CIA and Army projects like MK Ultra. They thought they were participating in harmless tests, but the experiments left many with broken minds and bodies. Once again, the logic was the same. Some lives could be sacrificed in the name of science, in the name of national security, in the name of progress. When the Tuskegee study was finally exposed in 1972, the public reaction was shock, outrage, even horror. How could this happen in America? How could doctors lie for 40 years while men suffered? But if you knew the deeper history, Tuskegee was not surprising. It was the continuation of everything that had come before. Enslaved women cut open in the name of surgery. Poor immigrants used as test subjects in hospitals. Native women sterilized. Prisoners experimented on. Soldiers exposed. Tuskegee was not an isolated crime. It was the most visible piece of a much larger pattern. The scandal forced reforms. Institutional review boards were created. Informed consent became a legal requirement. Medical ethics became stricter. But for the communities who had been harmed, these reforms came too late. For the men of Tuskegee, the apology came only in 1997, when President Bill Clinton publicly acknowledged their suffering. By then, almost all of them were dead. For the wives infected and the children born with congenital syphilis, there was no undoing the damage. And the legacy was not only physical, it was psychological. It created a mistrust that has never fully faded. In African American communities, mistrust of doctors and government health programs is not superstition. It is memory. It is inherited knowledge of betrayal. That mistrust continues to echo today in debates about vaccines, public health, and medical research. To rebuild trust, you cannot ignore the past. You must acknowledge it. Tuskegee is the ghost in the room every time a doctor asks for trust, every time a public health official asks for cooperation. It is the reminder that history has a price, and that trust once broken takes generations to heal. So, what do we do with this history? First, we remember. We say the names that history tried to erase: Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, the women who endured countless operations without anesthesia. The men of Tuskegee, who trusted their doctors and were betrayed. The native women, whose futures were stolen. The prisoners at Holmesburg, scarred by chemicals. The soldiers exposed to radiation and poisons by the very government they served. The poor, the immigrants, the orphans, whose bodies became test sites for progress, they would never benefit from. Second, we tell the truth. We refuse to sanitize history into a story of unbroken progress. We acknowledge that medicine in America is not only a story of healing, but also a story of power. Power over the powerless. Progress built on pain. And third, we demand that the lessons are never forgotten, that informed consent is real, that transparency is enforced, that the voices of patients, especially those most vulnerable, are heard. Because medicine should be a force of healing, not a tool of exploitation. The next time you hear about a medical breakthrough, remember the shadow question: who bore the risks and who reaped the rewards? That is the question history forces us to ask. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below. And let's keep uncovering the hidden truths of American history together.